Hallie Jackson Now. Weekdays at 5 on NBC News Now.
News is happening now.
Look at what's making headlines around the world.
Right now on Morning News Now.
We're coming on the air with breaking news.
And this is a significant moment.
Whenever it happens, wherever you are, NBC News, streaming free now.
Our show is about sparking conversations around today's biggest issues. The Fed raises interest rates. That controls inflation. Explain how that works. Is part of this that everyone's rethinking their jobs and their relationship to their employers? Could you just remind us why there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court instead of 3 or 20 or 2? It's not my job to tell you what to think. My job is to think about what you tell me.
Now Tonight with Joshua Johnson, streaming weeknights at 8 on NBC News Now.
News is happening now.
Look at what's making headlines around the world.
Whenever it happens, wherever you are, it's here now.
As we look out over the latest city-turned-crime scene, we see the things left behind. Back now with our NBC News exclusive.
Hurricane Ian has already left behind a path of death and destruction along much of Florida's Gulf Coast. Now residents of those waterfront communities are sifting through the devastation, trying to piece together what the storm left behind. Here's CNBC correspondent Valerie Castro with the story of one place.
Just widespread, complete destruction.
Matlacha, Florida is unrecognizable even to the people who live here. The small community left obliterated by Hurricane Ian.
It was so much worse than we expected, so much worse than we thought could ever happen.
John Lynch has lived here for 25 years. He and his family evacuated from this 2-story home. His uncle did live here, just next door.
Like, that was a beautiful, beautiful little cottage. It really was. I've been here since 1946, you know, and has been through many, many, many storms. So that was a shock.
Lynch's neighbor and friend decided to ride out the storm.
Yeah, it was rainy, it was scary, and it came fast. When the water came, the water came. It was one hell of a ride. By the time that everybody around me wanted to go, it was too late. Might as well just ride it out.
Would you do it again?
No.
And he knows others did not survive that same decision to stay.
They pulled a couple dead bodies out today, this morning early. The Coast Guard had them. And unfortunately, someone else passed away on that side over there.
Everywhere you look, the island community is shattered, splintered, in some places completely swallowed up by the storm. Behind me, this is a roof that used to belong to a motel here, and as you walk around, there are just piles and piles of debris. It's not clear where everything exactly came from in the first place. And beyond me, those pilings, that used to be a restaurant called Bert's. It has been there since the 1920s, although as you can see, it's not there anymore. This is what Bert's used to look like. These guys rode out the storm in this boat. It turned out to be a safe enough place, the storm tossing it up on what's left of solid ground. But anyone who called this place home now left with little to come home to.
That's CNBC correspondent Valerie Castro reporting.
And here with the latest from Fort Myers Beach is NBC News correspondent Blaine Alexander. Blaine, first off, what are people there in Fort Myers telling you about just how difficult the past few days have been for them?
Well, you know, Morgan, a lot of people that I've spoken to, believe it or not, are just getting down here to see the damage for the very first time. So the place where I'm standing right now is a very busy marina. People tell me that this is just a beehive of activity. It's where people come and rent boats, rent kayaks, and just kind of do a whole lot of water activities. And a lot of what you're seeing here behind me is really what it looks like up and down the strip. In fact, I talked with somebody who does business out of here. He says he rents kayaks and he rents a number of things. They thought that they would be able to kind of essentially batten down the hatches. They really tried to secure their kayaks, they tried to secure their boats, but really just underestimated the gross power of this storm. He told me that he spent much of the morning digging through mud, trying to get his kayaks out that had washed way over on the other side of the bushes, on the other side of some streets here. So that's really what a lot of people are saying. They're just trying to find their personal belongings because they're certainly not where they left them anymore. Morgan, I spoke with one woman who says she's on her way to check out her nephew's store. Here's what he told her.
He said that it is underwater, that maybe you can see the roof, but all the boats are gone. They don't know where they're at. They brought him over to Moss Marine to try to harbor them during the storm, and that...
So they tried to tack him down to keep him in place?
Yes, yes.
But that didn't work. The storm was too powerful?
Correct. I mean, as you can see, these boats are up and over the road, over a fence.
So that's another person telling essentially the same story. You know, that's really what we're hearing from person after person as they come back here just to survey the damage, Morgan.
Speaking of sort of finding their way, what about the transportation, Blaine? I mean, Hurricane Ian wiped out just a section of the Sunnyvale Causeway. Just how bad is the damage to even the roads that are connecting Fort Myers Beach to the rest of the city?
Well, it's certainly difficult. If you're driving around, it's certainly not the easiest. And that's kind of what's, I think, difficult for a lot of people. You can be driving, everything is smooth, and then suddenly you'll come up against a section of a road that's underwater or an exit ramp or something like that. You know, there are still a number of bridges in different counties throughout Florida, not just here, that are still being closed off by officials because either of standing water or because of debris that's in the road. The governor's office says it is a priority to get those back open, though, Morgan.
All right. NBC News correspondent Blaine Alexander live on the ground there in Fort Myers Beach for us. Blaine, thank you so much.
Millions are now being left to pick up the pieces from Hurricane Ian's widespread destruction. After the break, some tips on how best to cope after a trauma. You're watching NBC News Daily.
Tonight, I interviewed Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg about the ongoing delays. You seem to be pointing the finger at the airlines. They're pointing the finger back. Mr. Secretary, when is this going to get better?
Hey, podcast fans, ready to unlock our true crime mysteries? Try Dateline Premium on Apple Podcasts. You'll get early access to originals, plus bonus content, and everything is ad-free. So head to Apple Podcasts now to subscribe.
Our show is about sparking conversations around today's biggest issues. The Fed raises interest rates. That controls inflation. Explain how that works. Is part of this that everyone's rethinking their jobs and their relationship to their employers? Could you just remind us why there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court instead of 3 or 20 or 2? It's not my job to tell you what to think. My job is to think about what you tell me.
Now Tonight with Joshua Johnson, streaming weeknights at 8 on NBC News Now.
As we look out over the latest city-turned-crime scene, we see the things left behind. Back now with our NBC News exclusive.
News is happening now.
Look at what's making headlines around the world.
Whenever it happens, wherever you are, it's here now.
Internal Affairs, the new podcast from Dateline. Listen now.
You don't know when your moment's coming, but when it does, you take it.
Tonight, I interviewed Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg about the ongoing delays. You seem to be pointing the finger at the airlines. They're pointing the finger back. Mr. Secretary, when is this going to get better?
News is happening now.
Look at what's making headlines around the world.
Whenever it happens, wherever you are, it's here now.
The day's biggest political stories with trusted insight now and expert analysis now. A daily look at the politics behind the headlines. Meet the Press Now, streaming weekdays at 4 p.m. on NBC News Now.
Tonight, I interviewed Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg about the ongoing delays. You seem to be pointing the finger at the airlines. They're pointing the finger back. Mr. Secretary, when is this going to get better?
Welcome back. I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Morgan Radford. Making news right now. The Supreme Court just formally welcomed its newest member, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. The president and vice president were both in attendance for the private event where the Associate Justice took her oath. Justice Jackson is making history as the first black woman to sit on the high court. Monday is her first official day on the job.
Russian President Putin signed paperwork claiming to absorb 4 areas of Ukraine into his country. World leaders are calling the referendums a sham in those breakaway republics. It comes just hours after a deadly attack in Zaporizhia, where a Russian missile hit a humanitarian convoy, killing at least 25 people.
The FDA just approved the first ALS drug treatment in 5 years. The newly approved therapy helps protect nerve cells in the brain and in the spinal cord that are destroyed by ALS, slowing the disease's progress. Now, some of the funding for this new drug came from the proceeds of the Ice Bucket Challenge, which you may remember from back in 2014.
Good to see that's still doing some good work there. We continue our coverage of Hurricane Ian, now taking aim at the Carolina coast. After re-energizing into a Category 1 storm, Ian is now on track to slam into South Carolina soon with its second landfall. It's likely going to happen somewhere between Charleston and Myrtle Beach.
The South Carolina coast is already being lashed with heavy rains and strong winds. Now experts estimate that the storm surge could hit as high as 7 feet. Let's get right to NBC's Wendy Woolfolk live in Charleston, South Carolina. Wendy, a flash flood warning is currently in effect for that area. We can see the strong rain and the wind there just behind you as you're standing there. Talk to us about the concerns facing residents right now there in Charleston, which is a major target right now.
Joe and Morgan, things have gotten really bad since we spoke just a few minutes ago. If this thing is not imminent, we are very close. These are the strongest rain bands and gusts of wind we've experienced all morning long. At this point, we know all of downtown Charleston is without power, and then at least 30,000 other customers in the Low Country are also without power. We are standing on a balcony right now, safe with our crew and other people who decided to ride it out in this hotel. But can you believe there are people in this marina behind me who have chosen to ride out this storm, even though it's a Cat 1 inside those boats? I hope that that judgment pays off for them and that everyone stays safe and sound. The National Weather Service, in addition to the hurricane warning that is obvious, has extended the flash flood warning as well. That means do not travel. It is not safe to travel at this hour. As you can see behind me, there's a reason why. There is also a bridge in the background. You probably can't see it from where I'm standing. At this point, they are predicting that Ian is making its second U.S. landfall somewhere between Charleston and Myrtle Beach. And the biggest issue with exactly where it hits is where that dirty quadrant is going to be. The dirty quadrant means that northeastern side, which you get the storm surge, and they're promising it will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 7 feet. Add that to high tide that's already come in and to these massive rains, and there is going to be a lot of flood damage, not only on the coast here in South Carolina, but inland, all the way up to North Carolina and Virginia. Again, we can't complain about the damage that we'll see here in this area when you compare it to the damage that happened in Florida. But I just hope and pray, like I'm sure you do in New York, that everyone stays safe, because even though this is a Cat 1, it's a terrible one.
Yeah,
That's it from here in Charleston. Back to you in New York.
NBC's Wendy Woolfolk. We hope you continue to stay safe. Thank you so much for that report.
About 2 hours north of Charleston, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina is sitting on the opposite end of that potential landfall zone. The community there is bracing for impact to come, including wind gusts that could exceed 90 miles per hour. We're now joined by Emergency Manager for Myrtle Beach, Travis Glatke. Travis, thank you for making the time for us today, especially in the midst of everything you all have going on. With storm surge that could get as high as 7 feet, as we just mentioned, how are you sort of keeping tabs on what's happening in the area, and really how many people do you estimate are at risk?
So we closed the beach on Thursday. We've also closed the beach today, obviously. We've been getting out the messages to all the residents and visitors within the city to make sure that they know to stay away from the beach areas. We do have roads along the beach that are now inaccessible due to that storm surge. When you put that with 4 to 6 inches of rain, there's flooding, especially in the low-lying areas within our beachside areas.
And Travis, I mean, President Biden declared an emergency there in South Carolina, expected to send federal resources. And I know you're in the thick of it right now, but in the coming days and in the weeks, what do you anticipate that you all will need?
You know, right now we've been preparing over the past week or so. We figured that a strong tropical storm was going to hit us. You know, unfortunately, it strengthened to that hurricane level. So we do have preparations already in place. If federal resources were needed. Our big thing is making sure that we have upstaffed our ocean rescue teams. We have had to do a couple of surf rescues yesterday afternoon and in the evening. As far as federal resources, unfortunately, it's kind of one of those wait and see type things. We're just getting the messages out to people, stay indoors, hunker down. We're going to get through this.
And finally, Travis, I know that, sort of being a beach town that sees a slew of tourists every year, talk to us about the potential ripple effects to your community from both sort of an infrastructure standpoint and a financial one.
Yeah, I mean, we've had calls all week. Hotels have been offering our employees and staff the opportunity to stay with them for free because they have had so many cancellations. Our Coastal Carolina University football team had to push their game back to 7 p.m. on Saturday. As far as the long-term effects, we're going to make sure that everything's in place and that we're going to make sure that, paperwork's ready. Any sort of financial assistance, everything's already in place.
Well, we certainly appreciate all of the hard work that you and your team and just your broader community is doing to keep people safe and help them get back on their feet. Emergency Manager for Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, Travis Glatke. Thank you so much, Travis.
Yesterday, we brought you the heart-wrenching story of Renee Smith, who was forced to ride out Hurricane Ian with her terminally ill husband. NBC News senior national correspondent Carrie Sanders has more on her story and others who defied the odds.
From the air, the devastation in Lee County comes into focus, while on the ground, first responders desperately trying to reach those in distress. At the height of the storm, some first responders risking their own lives. A drowning prevented.
Our staff, police, fire, public works, parks got out there and made close to about 200 water rescues. The guys getting into, 4 feet, 10 feet of water and getting people out, getting into shelters.
Sanibel and Captiva Islands now cut off from the mainland. Both islands were washed over by storm surge, trapping those who didn't leave. Some houses with their roofs ripped off, others obliterated, boats capsized and grounded. Coast Guard helicopters pulling people to safety, also sending rescue swimmers to check boats for stranded survivors.
Even their eyes looking up and giving you a handshake or a pat in the back as you're getting brought back into the helicopter and bringing them back down on deck, it's pretty unforgettable.
Punta Gorda got lashed by Ian's fierce 155-mile-per-hour winds, but fortunately, there was no storm surge.
Hi, sweetie, it's Mommy. I'm in Punta Gorda. Daddy's alive. I'm alive.
Residents like Renee Smith reaching out to loved ones after a harrowing night. Her husband, Christopher, recently paralyzed from the chest down when his cancer spread to his spine.
All I could do was put a tarp over his hospital bed and zip tie it and put a life preserver on his neck because I didn't want him to drown in his hospital bed in my living room. After 30 years, I still love him. I'm not going to let him drown in the living room. I mean, who does that? I couldn't move his bed. I couldn't move his bed to where I was hiding.
Their 121-year-old house, just 2 blocks from the water, rocked as the hurricane roared.
What was it like for you?
So it was very scary in that there wasn't a goddamn thing I could do but just sit here and look out the window.
Renee, who hid under a table surrounded by pillows, tells me she felt guilty. She couldn't do more for her husband.
I felt helpless, and I didn't think that these would hold,
All right, well.
And I know that you felt like you were in a body bag here, but it helped you.
Shaken, but relieved to be together.
Our house appears to
This
be
incredible story. Our thanks to NBC News correspondent Carrie Sanders for bringing us that report. Now, the staggering scale of Hurricane Ian's physical destruction is coming into focus, but the storm's psychological toll, that's going to be much harder to measure.
Yeah, in our mental health check today, we want to take a look at the intense trauma that a major loss or a natural disaster can cause, and really what are the best ways to cope with it. Joining us now, we have Dr. Zuma Deluxe. She's a psychiatrist and the author of What a Happy Family. Dr. Deluxe, this is such an important topic. People, as Joe mentioned, they see sort of the physical toll. It's tactile, you can see it, you can touch it, but then inside something happens to people. What should people do if they're in the midst of this, or they're even watching their family or friends go through this?
So awareness is a really big, important first step. So knowing that someone can feel a variety of emotions. So I'm thinking shock, grief, sadness, anger, a mix of all of those things. And it's also possible to feel different things in the short, medium, and long term after a traumatic event has occurred. In terms of what we can do about that, now a lot of people, when they're overwhelmed by stress, they want to retreat, and that's really understandable. But we can heal in support. We can heal with connections. So whether that means reaching out to someone you trust, a family member, a friend, a mental health provider, or going to a support group and leaning into community, knowing that you don't have to go through this alone is really important for coping.
That tendency we have to withdraw, I mean, it is there. So what can we do to fight that urge?
So I think just being aware is the first big step. And second is to actually have that person or that group of people that you can call. So having those numbers there, having that person who's going to check on you, and having that kind of initiative that you take can be a good first step if you know that when you tend to get stressed, what you might do is retreat and kind of want to be by yourself during those moments.
It's interesting, just a moment ago, you mentioned sort of these three different, I don't know if you could call it stages of grief, but you can feel it differently in the immediate, short, and long term. How does that look? I mean, how is it different over time?
So it's different for different people, but it's important to remember that at first people might be in survival mode. You know, they just want to know what they can control, what they can fix, and they might not even fully process the traumatic event for weeks to months after. And so that's why that emotional cascade and mix can really vary. So I really encourage people to remember that healing isn't linear, coping isn't linear, and grieving isn't linear.
Life isn't linear.
Life isn't linear. I love that. That is the takeaway.
I like that.
Absolutely.
All right. Dr. Zuma Deluxe, as always, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
All right, well, our coverage of Hurricane Ian's second landfall continues. More NBC News Daily right after this.
News is happening now.
Look at what's making headlines around the world.
Whenever it happens, wherever you are, it's here now.
Our show is about sparking conversations around today's biggest issues. The Fed raises interest rates. That controls inflation. Explain how that works. Is part of this that everyone's rethinking their jobs and their relationship to their employers? Could you just remind us why there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court instead of 3 or 20 or 2? It's not my job to tell you what to think. My job is to think about what you tell me.
Now Tonight with Joshua Johnson, streaming weeknights at 8 on NBC News Now.
Stay on top of breaking news and the biggest stories of the day with NBC News Daily.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Morgan Radford.
And I'm Vicki Lynn.
I'm Aaron Gilchrist.
And I'm Kate Snow.
Get in-depth reporting from across the country.
What's your reaction to the president's comments?
And around the world.
Are Ukrainians continuing to make advances?
And ways you can take care of your health.
Who should be getting tested? And frankly, how often?
And your wallet.
Costs are skyrocketing. How to manage soaring prices.
NBC News Daily. Weekdays from 12 to 4 p.m. Eastern on NBC News Now.
NBC News, streaming free now.
Top Story with Tom Llamas is your news playlist on NBC News Now. And now, you can listen to it as a podcast. Available anytime and anywhere.
No stress, no mess, just yum.
That's it.
Right now on NBC News Now,
We begin with breaking news just coming in.
What's happening now, what's happening next, and what it means for you.
We're continuing to follow the Russian attack on Ukraine.
There's an intense artillery battle underway.
As we look out over the latest city-turned-crime scene, we see the things left behind.
Fewer people are content to just offer their thoughts and prayers.
Stunning testimony at the January 6th hearing.
Americans face the highest inflation rate in decades.
Parts of Virginia cleaning up after severe storms.
Flames forcing thousands to evacuate.
When do I play meteorologist? Only when the heat is this bad.
Another special night of election coverage right here at NBC News Now.
Results are coming in.
This Tuesday is going to be huge.
This is big when we're talking about November.
This feels like an ideological fight to the death. Is there room for common ground?
What do you think when you see the activism?
Do you think this could have happened without social media?
We're coming on the air with the news NBC Scoop.
Bringing the news to you is not only a job, it's an honor.
Hurricane Ian is getting close to landfall in South Carolina. Even as a weaker storm, it can still do severe damage. Joining us now is storm chaser Nicholas Isabella. Nicholas, thanks so much for joining us. So we know this is a Category 1. How could the damage in South Carolina compare to what we've been seeing now over the last couple days in Florida, where it hit as a Category 4?
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. The wind is going to be a lot less up here, but they're going to have to deal with flooding. There's a lot of heavy rainfall going on right now and a lot of coastal flooding. Moments ago, we were in the eye of Ian as it just made landfall, and now we're heading on north to see some of the flooding.
Speaking of that, Nicholas, I mean, the part of South Carolina that we're talking about is referred to as the low country, right? Because it barely rises above sea level. So what do you suspect you're going to see in terms of storm surge, specifically in these hours to come?
We're going to see a lot of flooding in the roadways along the beach and neighboring areas. There's already a lot of flooding going on. There's a pier that's getting damaged right now. So it's a very low area, and a lot of neighborhoods are going to begin to get flooded. I think the forecast calls for 6 to 8 feet of surge.
As an experienced storm chaser, I mean, is that your biggest fear, or what is your biggest fear when it comes to Hurricane Ian right now, making this second landfall in South Carolina?
Water is always the scariest thing. The surge comes up so quick. That's why it's very important to plan ahead and know your elevation and surroundings.
All right, Nicholas, Isabella, thank you so much. Please stay safe, and we will check in with you throughout the day and the coming days as it warms.
Yeah, this is a storm that's really been moving and very dynamic. And again, we're watching to see it hit South Carolina. Let's go ahead and bring in NBC News meteorologist Bill Caron.